They thought I wouldn't feel the shove. At 78, people assume your senses dull like old knives, but I felt every finger on the back of that wheelchair, every tremor in the wooden boards as they rolled me toward the lake. Just a little closer, one of them whispered. And then, one hard push, the splash, and the sickening sound of their footsteps retreating as if I were already dead. Cold swallowed me. Water climbed over my shoulders, my face, my hair. I did not scream. I let myself sink a moment, long enough to hear their voices above me. Muffled, greedy, unafraid. She drowned. Now we get the 11 million. Those were the first words I heard after they tried to kill me. Not my name, not fear, not even guilt, just money. People always think the elderly forget how to fight for breath, how to claw toward life. But I grew up on the Atlantic shore. And even now, when my legs fail me and a cane waits by my bed every morning, my body remembers water. I pushed off the weight of the dress, angled myself sideways, and swam slow, heavy, but steady toward the shadow of the pier. When my fingers touched the barnacled post, I almost laughed. After everything they'd done over the years, after every quiet humiliation, every patronizing sigh, every time they spoke over me as if I were a piece of old furniture. This was the moment they chose to underestimate me, and it was the last mistake they would ever make. I surfaced behind the wooden skirting of the dock, hidden from sight. I heard them talking somewhere above, voices low, urgent. My son-in-law's tense murmur, my nephew's shaky breath, my own daughter silent. Of course she was silent. Silence had become her specialty, her shield, her cowardice. She sank fast. One of the men said, "Camera won't see anything, it's done." Camera. My hand froze against the slick wood. They hadn't bothered to look behind themselves, not once. They never looked at the things that didn't serve them. The security light blinked faintly near the boathouse, and I remembered the marina had installed new surveillance last spring, a wide-angle, motion-activated, recording constantly on weekends. They didn't know that, but I did. By the time they walked away, convinced they'd solved all their financial troubles in one afternoon, I had already mapped out my path to the shore. The water numbed my arms, my legs, even my jaw. But I kept moving, inch by painful inch, until I felt mud under my palms, until I could drag my body forward. The world above looked almost peaceful, evening light. Dragonflies skimming the surface. The laughter of teenagers across the lake. Ordinary life going on as if my death had been a small, forgettable thing. I sat there for a moment, soaked, hair plastered to my skull, dress ruined, heart steady, not frightened, not broken. Something inside me had cracked wide open, yes, but it wasn't fear. It was clarity. For years I had known they were circling me like hungry fish, waiting for weakness. For years I had told myself to forgive, to stay quiet, to love them past their flaws. And for years they used my kindness as a convenient little staircase to climb over me. But today they showed me the truth with their own hands, and I would not unsee it again. I got up slowly, painfully, and began the long walk home. Water dripping from me like the last remnants of my old life. They thought I had drowned. They thought the lake had taken me for good. But I was still here. And for the first time in decades, I was no longer afraid of what came next. By the time I reached my front porch, the sun had already slipped behind the pines, leaving only that pale, tired light that leaks into the world before night settles. My dress clung to me like wet skin. My hair dripped down my back. My shoes squatched with every step. I must have looked like some ghost that crawled out of the lake instead of into it. But I walked slow, stiff, leaning on the railing for balance. My legs shook from the cold and from the effort, but they carried me farther than my family ever expected they would again. When I pushed open the front door, the house greeted me with its usual quiet. No perfume of dinner in the air, no hum of conversation, just the worn smell of home. Old wood, paper, tea leaves. Nothing had been disturbed. They hadn't rushed here afterward to check, to pretend concern. Of course they hadn't. I closed the door behind me, and only then did I notice the trembling in my hands. Not fear, just the shock settling in. I sat down on the little bench by the entryway and peeled off my soaked cardigan. Water pulled on the floorboards. I could hear my own breathing, ragged but steady. The clock in the hallway ticked its slow, indifferent rhythm, the same as every night. It should have been a comfort. Instead, it felt like a reminder. This house had stood by me better than the people I raised. I took a moment before moving again. My legs felt like cold sand. I rubbed them to bring back some warmth, then pushed myself up and walked to the kitchen. Habit guided me more than thought. I put on the kettle, even though I was shaking too hard to hold a cup properly. Old women aren't supposed to climb out of lakes after their own blood tries to drown them, but old habits stay with you. While the water heated, I glanced at the window. A car rolled past the house. Slow, familiar shape, familiar headlights. My daughter's husband, Grant. He didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. Probably checking to make sure no police cruisers were parked outside. It was strange. I'd always thought the worst thing he'd ever done to me was take advantage of my generosity. I hadn't realized until today that advantage has a bottom to it. Once they reach the bottom, they give you the final push. The kettle clicked off. I made tea but didn't drink it. I just cupped the mug in my hands, letting the warmth bleed into my fingers. I should have called someone, the police, a neighbor, my doctor, anyone. But my mind kept circling the same quiet truth. They believed I was dead. And that gave me time. Time to think, time to act, time to slip through the cracks of their assumptions like water through a rotten board. I changed into dry clothes, folded the wet ones, and set them in the laundry basket. Not because they mattered, but because I needed to do something small and normal, something that didn't involve the taste of lake water and betrayal. Then I sat in the living room. My husband's photograph stood on the mantel, the same place it had been for 20 years. He was smiling, sunburned, squinting into the camera the day we bought this house. It had felt too big for us then. Now it felt too empty. "You'd know what to do," I whispered to him. My voice cracked a little. It wasn't grief, just exhaustion. He'd always been the one with clear judgment. Me, I'd forgiven too easily, trusted too long, swallowed too much for the sake of peace. Peace that, as it turned out, only benefited the people willing to hurt me. My thoughts drifted back to the lake. The feel of the water, the tilt of the dock, their voices, the way my daughter didn't say a single word. What keeps a woman silent while her own mother is being murdered? Fear, weakness, dependence. None of those excuses mattered anymore. I leaned back, feeling the ache in my bones. The house creaked as if settling deeper into itself. Outside, a stray dog barked once, then fell quiet. I knew they would come eventually, not to check if I was alive, but to start planning how to explain my accident. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day. They'd wait just long enough to make it believable. Let them wait. The camera at the dock had everything, and I needed to be careful with everything that happened next. One wrong move, and they'd twist my survival into confusion, into age, into poor memory, into anything that freed them. I closed my eyes, letting the silence fold around me like a blanket. Not a comforting one, but one I could use to gather strength. Tonight wasn't for decisions. Tonight was for breathing, for letting my body recover, for accepting what had already begun. Long before the lake, they thought the water would finish me. But tomorrow, I would begin something of my own. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my side, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling, the one my husband used to promise he'd fix next weekend. He never fixed it, and after he died, I never asked anyone else. Some things you leave untouched because they remind you of who you were with the person you lost. The house felt too quiet, even for me. Usually, silence comforts me. It has weight, warmth, a shape. But that night, it felt like something pressing against my ribs. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the water swallowing me. Heard their voices, that cold certainty in them. She drowned as if they'd simply tossed out a broken tool. Around 4 a.m, when the dark outside turned that strange blue that isn't night anymore, but not morning either. I pushed myself upright. My joints protested. My breath felt thin. But I knew lying in bed would only let the fear settle deeper into me, and I was too old to let fear take root again. I turned on the lamp beside the bed. Its warm light spilled across the room, catching the dust on the dresser, the old quilt at my feet. The framed photos lined neatly along the wall. My daughter at 12, gap-toothed and grinning. My husband in his uniform holding a fishing rod. My nephew at 9 leaning against me like he belonged there. They all looked so young on those shelves, innocent before life hardened them, before money twisted everything. I stood up slowly, steadier than I expected, and walked to the bathroom. The mirror showed an older woman than the one I felt inside. Hair gray and thin at the temples, eyes tired, skin creased with the years of living and forgiving. But there was something else there, too, something I hadn't seen in a long time. A tightness around my mouth, a steadiness in my gaze. Resolve. I washed my face and cupped water in my palms, letting it drip down my neck, washing off the remnants of lake water and the grime of their betrayal. Then I wrapped myself in my old robe and padded into the kitchen. The kettle felt heavier than usual, or maybe it was my hands. I filled it, set it on the stove, and leaned on the counter while it warmed. The slow hiss of heating metal filled the room. Little sounds matter when you're alone. They keep you anchored. I took out my old address book, the one with frayed edges and phone numbers written in my careful handwriting. My husband's handwriting still lingered on a few pages, too. He always pressed too hard with the pen, as though the ink would vanish if he didn't carve it into the paper. I ran my fingers over his letters. Beside his name was the number of the lawyer he trusted most, written almost 20 years ago, Daniel Reeves. I hadn't spoken to him in a decade. He retired, I'd heard. Still, the number was there. And in my experience, men like him never fully retire. But it wasn't time to call. Not yet. Not while they still believed I was dead. I needed them to stay comfortable in that lie a little longer. People reveal the most when they aren't afraid of consequences. The kettle clicked off. I poured myself tea and sat at the table. The steam fogged my glasses. For a while, I just held the mug, letting the heat soak into my fingers. My hands had always been my strongest part. They raised a child, tended to a husband, sorted thousands of library books, wrote letters that shaped small lives. Now they trembled just a little. Age does that, but they still worked. I spread out the mail on the table, bills I didn't recognize, statements with strange charges, insurance letters addressed to me about my own declining cognitive function, letters I never saw before. Grant must have been intercepting them or forging them. That man had always been too smooth, too confident, too ready to say the right thing and then act the wrong one. My daughter, Wendy, used to swear he was good for her. "Mom, he's ambitious," she'd say. "He pushes me." I remember telling her years ago that there's a difference between a man who lifts you and a man who stands on your shoulders. She laughed, then told me I worried too much. I wonder what she'll say now, if she'll say anything at all. I sipped my tea. The taste steadied me, earthy, familiar. When the clock struck 6, I pulled on a sweater and stepped outside. The air was cold, sharp, and clean. Morning birds were calling from the trees, oblivious to what happened the night before. I walked down the driveway slowly, testing the strength of my legs. They held barely, but they held. At the end of the driveway, I stopped and looked up the street. No car, no movement, just a neighborhood waking up, unaware that a woman who was supposed to be dead was standing in her slippers on her front lawn. I took a long breath. It burned a little in my chest, but it felt good. Real. Today, I told myself, wasn't the day for confrontation. Today was the day I began quietly pulling back everything they had taken. All the years, all the money, all the dignity. I turned back toward the house and went inside, closing the door gently. My hands were steady now. The water hadn't drowned me. It had washed me clean. By mid-morning, I felt steady enough to drive. Not comfortable, but steady. At 78, you do not confuse those two things. Comfort is a warm blanket. Steadiness is the cold knowledge that your hands will not slip on the wheel when the world around you is falling apart. I dressed with deliberate care, choosing plain trousers, a thick wool sweater, and the heavy brown coat my husband bought me for our last anniversary. It still carried the faint, ghostly scent of cedar. I brushed my hair, pinning it back until my scalp felt tight, and looked at the woman in the hallway mirror. A woman who had crawled out of a lake looked back, but her spine was a rod of iron. Whatever softness I once carried for my family had drained away like water from a cracked bowl, leaving only the sediment of resolve. I took my purse, my keys, and the old leather folder I kept for important papers, though none of those papers had been important enough until last night. I stepped outside, locked the door with a satisfying click, and drove to the bank. It was a small, unimpressive building, but the tellers had known me for decades, long before 11 million ever passed through my hands. Inside, the lights were clinical and bright. A young man greeted me, but I didn't want pleasantries. I asked for my financial manager. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, standing as I entered her glass-walled office. "You look a little pale. Are you quite all right?" "I'm fine," I replied, lowering myself into the chair. "I need to review my accounts. Every automatic payment, every transfer, and every authorization granted to my family." Her professional politeness shifted into something sharper, hesitation. She pulled up the records, and the tapping of her keyboard was the only sound in the room. Then she frowned, swiveling the screen toward me. Lines of transactions filled the page. Monthly transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, luxury subscriptions, insurance premiums for cars I didn't own, and loan repayments that had nothing to do with me. Grant's fingerprints were everywhere, a quiet, confident theft. "I want every single one of them canceled today," I said. She hesitated, mentioning a power of attorney I'd signed 3 years ago. "I know what it gives him," I said, my voice low but immovable, "and I want it revoked." She studied me, seeing something in my eyes that stopped her from arguing. As I signed the thick stack of papers, a strange calm washed over me. This was a reclaiming. She then printed a detailed ledger, page after page of a story more brutal than any words, vacations I never took, medical bills for strangers, and debts built on lies. I slid the pages into my folder, my hands finally still. As I left the bank, the sun was high, warming the pavement. People passed me, unaware that a woman supposed to be dead had just taken back her life piece by piece. I came home with a folder so thick it barely closed. I set it on the kitchen table and brewed tea, looking out at the maple tree in the yard. It understood survival. By noon, the house was still silent. No frantic calls, no knocks. They still thought I was at the bottom of the lake, likely planning how to perform their grief. I almost pitied them. In the early afternoon, I heard the crunch of gravel. Through the window, I saw Milo, my nephew, walking up the path. He stood on the porch for a long moment, checking the street like a thief. He knocked 3 times, light taps, the way he did as a boy. I opened the door. His face turned the color of ash. If fear had a sound, it would have been his sharp, jagged inhale. "Aunt Em," he stammered, his eyes bulging. "Where have you been?" "In my house," I said. "Where else would I be?" He stared at me as if I were a ghost dripping with weeds. "You weren't here last night," he said, his hands twitching. I raised an eyebrow. "You and who?" That rattled him. He looked at the ground, mumbling about a loan, a business share, another emergency. "I can't help you anymore, Milo," I said. "Things have changed." His jaw tightened, and for a second I saw the man who had spent too long digging holes he couldn't climb out of. "Please," he whispered. Grant said. I didn't let him finish. I remembered his voice on the dock. She sank fast. "No, Milo," I said. He backed away, muttering that I was making a mistake. "I've made plenty," I replied, "but this isn't one of them." I closed the door and leaned against it. My heart didn't race. The lake had washed away the capacity for that kind of panic. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Evidence doesn't shout, it waits. I drove to the marina, the air sharp and cold. The office was a squat building with fogged windows. I told the young man at the counter I needed the footage from Dock 3. He hesitated until I told him someone tried to kill me. The manager, a weathered woman with eyes that had seen every waterborne tragedy, led me to a back room. We watched the monitor. There I was, small and frail in that wheelchair. And there they were, Grant's firm hand on the handle, Milo's nervous glances, and Wendy standing just far enough away to pretend she wasn't there. Then the shove, my body hitting the water. My daughter turning her face away. The manager whistled. I didn't flinch. I had already lived it. "I'll need a copy," I said. She handed me a flash drive, her fingers lingering on mine with a silent, respectful weight. I walked back to the car, passing the dock where it happened. They thought I'd vanish, but now the camera knew the truth. I didn't drive home. I went to the only person I trusted, Daniel Reeves. His office was above a hardware store, smelling of old paper and dust. When I set the flash drive on his desk, he looked at me with a hollow expression. "Tell me everything," he said. I told him the story of the lake, the shove, and the silence. His anger was a quiet, professional heat. We spent hours signing forms, a new power of attorney, a protected trust, a wall of legal iron between me and my blood. When he locked the flash drive in his safe, the click sounded like the end of an era. "That," he said, "is the sound of your future no longer depending on the people who tried to drown you." I left his office and drove to the public pier, sitting where my husband and I used to share sandwiches decades ago. I remembered his voice. "Quiet doesn't mean small, Em." I had been small for too long. I stayed until the wind turned bitter, then returned to a house that finally felt like mine. Just after 6, my granddaughter Lillian arrived. She was the only one who still saw me. She brought soup and bread, her presence a warm contrast to the icy betrayal of the others. "Grandma," she said, "you look different." "I've been making changes," I told her. I told her she was now my agent, my protector. She cried, not from greed, but from the weight of the trust. After she left, I felt solid. The next morning, Daniel called with the audit results. Grant had stolen $300,000 through fraudulent credits. Milo had used my name to guarantee a loan for a criminal group under federal investigation. They weren't just using me, they were building their own safety nets out of my skin. That afternoon, the storm broke. Grant's car roared up the driveway. He burst in, his face a mask of panicked rage. "The accounts are frozen," he screamed. "Why would you do this? You need us." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You tried to kill me." He froze. The bravado cracked like a mirror. "You don't have proof," he snapped. I told him about the camera. He laughed, a desperate, ugly sound, until I told him it was already in a safe. He stormed out, leaving the door swinging. I locked it, the metal bolt sliding home with finality. He had shown me the cost of trust. I was showing him the cost of malice. The next day, the police arrived. Not for me, but because Grant had reported me as confused. I invited them in, handed them a copy of the video, and watched their professional masks slip into horror. "Mrs. Caldwell," the sergeant said, "you've done the right thing." "I didn't do it to be right," I told him. "I did it because they left me no other choice." By the end of the day, the investigation was formal. The truth had footsteps now. It had a badge. I sat in my armchair as the evening light faded, watching the shadows stretch across the floor. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't grieving. I was simply waiting for the final act to begin. I had survived the water, and now I would survive the fire they had started. My family thought they had buried me, but they didn't realize I was a seed, and I was finally beginning to grow in the dark. The folder on my table was no longer a weight. It was a weapon. Every transaction, every forged signature, every moment of my daughter's silence was recorded and ready. I looked at the photograph of my husband on the mantel and whispered, "I'm doing it, Arthur. I'm taking it all back." The house creaked, settled, and for the first time in 20 years, it felt like it was standing guard over me instead of trapping me. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, but I didn't shiver. I reached for my tea, the cup steady in my hand, and waited for the morning to come. I knew what lay ahead, the arrests, the courtrooms, the desperate apologies that would come too late. I was ready for all of it. A woman who has seen the bottom of a lake and swam back to the light has nothing left to fear from men like Grant or boys like Milo. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me into a deep, dreamless sleep, the sleep of the vindicated. Tomorrow would be the day the world found out that Ira Caldwell was very much alive and that she was finished being pushed. The inheritance of shadows was over. The reckoning had begun. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Maybe because small towns have long memories, or maybe because the officers saw my face and understood more than I said. Or maybe because the footage spoke louder than any trembling words could have. 2 days after the police visit, a cruiser parked again outside my house. This time it was not quiet. I watched from the window as Grant stood on my lawn, hand-scuffed, his arrogance wiped clean from his face. He didn't look toward my house once. Shame does that. It forces a man to stare at the ground he once walked like he owned it. Milo was picked up an hour later. I didn't see it myself, but Daniel called to tell me. He ran, Daniel said, but not far. Running had always been his instinct. It was the standing still that he never mastered. Wendy wasn't arrested. She hadn't touched me, hadn't pushed. Her crime was silence, and silence is a wound that doesn't fit in legal boxes. But she came to my house that afternoon, small and pale, as if the world had suddenly grown too large for her. She knocked softly. I opened the door. Her eyes were red, mascara smudged, hair unbrushed. She looked like the child she used to be, lost, unsure, painfully tender. "Mom," she whispered. "They took Grant." "I know," I said. She pressed a hand to her mouth. "They showed me the video." I stepped aside so she could come in. She moved slowly like someone walking barefoot over broken glass. In the living room, she didn't sit right away. She hovered near the armchair before finally lowering herself into it, shoulders folding inward. I didn't think, her voice cracked, I didn't think he'd do it. Not really. He said it was just pressure, that we needed to talk to you, that maybe scaring you just a little would make things easier. I didn't know he'd push you. I didn't know you knew enough, I said. Not sharp, just true. She swallowed hard. I was afraid of him, I know. And I was afraid of losing everything. I sat down across from her. Fear doesn't excuse what happened, I know that too. She wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. I didn't come to defend myself. I know what I did or didn't do. I just came to see if you hated me. I let the question hang in the air. Hate is a heavy word, too heavy for someone I once held in my arms when she was feverish and small, whispering stories until she slept. "No," I said finally. "I don't hate you." Her shoulders shook, but I added, "I can't pretend this didn't happen." She nodded, tears dripping silently onto her hands. "I want to fix things," she whispered. "I don't know how, but I want to." "You start," I said softly, "by standing on your own feet, not on mine." She nodded again, small, frightened, but honest. And honesty, even late, is still honesty. When she left, the house felt heavy for a moment, but not in the same way as before. This weight wasn't betrayal anymore. It was aftermath. Aftermath has edges, but it doesn't drown. That evening, Daniel called again. "Charges are filed," he said. "Your testimony won't be needed until next week." "Good. And Amara, the trust is secure. Everything is in your granddaughter's name if anything happens to you. Exactly how you asked." I closed my eyes for a moment. Not from exhaustion, but from relief that wasn't soft. It was clean. "Thank you," I said. When the house went quiet again, I sat alone with the last cup of tea for the night. The steam rose slowly. Outside, the street lights flickered on. Things were breaking apart, some relationships, some illusions, some long-held lies, but I wasn't breaking. I was finally standing. The week after the arrests passed in a strange kind of quiet. Not the hollow silence that used to settle over this house like dust, but something clearer, cleaner. I woke up each morning without holding my breath, and that alone felt like a small miracle. I spent the first few days doing ordinary things. Laundry, sorting old letters, trimming the dead branches on my rose bushes. My body still ached, but not the way it had when fear lived inside my joints. This ache was familiar, the ordinary kind that comes with age and weather changes. Daniel called often, more than he had reason to, but I knew why. Some people check on you because the law requires it. Others check because they remember who you used to be when life hadn't yet bruised you. Daniel fell into the second category. By Thursday, he said something that stayed with me. Amora, you don't have to stay in that house forever. You can start over if you want. Start over at 78. I laughed a little at that, but the idea didn't slip away the way I expected. It lingered. That night, I sat by the window and looked out at the yard. The maple tree was thinning and the paint on the porch rail was peeling. This house had held me through grief, through loneliness, through quiet betrayals that arrived disguised as concern, but maybe it had done its share. Maybe I had too. The next morning, I packed a small bag and drove toward the coast. The cottage I found wasn't new or fancy. It was a small place, white paint chipped at the corners, sitting a few streets from the shoreline. The owner, a widder my age, seemed surprised I wanted it. "You're sure?" he asked. "Most folks your age want something closer to town." "I've spent enough years close to things," I said. "I want something a little farther from all that." When I stepped inside, the air smelled like old pine and sea salt. The floors creaked. The light was soft. There was no family history here, no shadows in the corners, just space. I didn't sign anything that day. I simply sat on the small porch for a while, listening to the distant crash of waves. The sound was comforting, predictable. Water doesn't lie. It tells you everything by the way it moves. I drove home slowly, letting the idea take root. The next days were a flurry of decisions, quiet ones. I told Daniel to prepare the purchase papers. I visited the cottage again. I stood on its porch and watched the gulls trace wide circles over the ocean. I thought of my husband then, not the younger man from photographs, but the version of him I carried in my memory, tired, gentle, stubborn in all the right ways. He would have liked the cottage. He would have stood beside me on that porch with his arm around my shoulders and said, "This feels right, Em." And it did. It felt right. On the day I signed the papers, Lillian drove me. She didn't ask many questions. She just held my hand when the keys were finally placed in my palm. "You sure?" she whispered. "Yes," I said. "This is mine." Back at home, I began packing slowly, not hurried, not emotional, just decisive. I boxed up what mattered, a few books, photographs, my husband's watch, the quilt, the teapot that survived every decade of my life. The rest I left behind without ceremony. Let the house hold its memories. I didn't need to carry them all. The night before the movers came, I sat alone in the living room. The walls looked too bare, too honest without their usual clutter. I let my fingers trace the arm of the chair, the same chair I'd sat in the night after the lake. It was strange how quickly a life could shift, how sharply a woman could change once she remembered her own worth. I wasn't running away. I was moving toward something. A place where no footsteps would creep down my hallway with intentions soaked in greed. A place where no hands would push me toward dark water. A place where the silence wasn't heavy with unspoken debts. A place where I belonged to myself again. When I went to bed that night, I slept, not lightly, not fitfully. I slept the way a woman sleeps when she has finally decided she deserves a life that doesn't hurt. The cottage felt like a different kind of quiet the moment I stepped inside with the last of the boxes. Not the hollow quiet of my old house, where silence settled like dust on unused corners of my life. This quiet had shape, breath, and a pulse I could almost hear if I stood still enough. I placed the box on the wooden floor and straightened slowly, letting my knees adjust. The windows were open, letting the sea wind move through the rooms. Curtains I hadn't hung yet fluttered like hands waving me forward. The air smelled of salt and pine sap, clean, honest. I carried the box to the small kitchen and unpacked my old teapot first. Some things stay with you because they've earned their place. I set it on the stove, turned on the kettle, and leaned against the counter, breathing in the simple truth of a new beginning. No footsteps overhead, no raised voices, no waiting for a door to slam, just the steady rhythm of the ocean rolling in and rolling out. I heard a soft knock on the porch. When I opened the door, Lillian stood there with a bag of fresh groceries. "I thought you might need these," she said. "New kitchens feel empty at first." "Not for long," I replied, stepping aside. She wandered the small living room, smiling at the mismatched furniture, the faded rug, the chipped bookshelf. "Feels like a place where someone can breathe," she said. "It is." She hugged me before she left, a long, quiet hug that didn't ask for anything. When she drove away, I stood on the porch for a while, watching the sky blush into evening. Later, I made tea and took my cup down the narrow path to the beach. The sand was cool under my shoes. The waves curled in slow lines, brushing the shore like they were smoothing out the edges of the world. I sat on a driftwood log and let the wind push my hair back. My body ached, yes, but not the kind of ache that frightened me. This was the ache of a life lived, not stolen. Grant and Milo were awaiting hearings. Wendy had visited twice, quiet, careful visits where she spoke little and listened much. I didn't promise her reconciliation, but I didn't close the door either. Some wounds need time. Some people do, too. As for me, I had no more battles left to fight, only days to live slowly and freely. I didn't crave victory, I craved peace. And peace, for the first time in many years, felt reachable. I sipped my tea and watched the line where the sea met the sky. I thought of all the versions of myself I'd been: wife, mother, caretaker, forgiver, survivor. Now I was simply a woman sitting by the water, claiming nothing but her own quiet dignity. The lake had tried to take me. My family had nearly helped it. But I walked out of that cold water with more than breath. I walked out with a future. The waves curled closer, then slipped away, a steady rhythm, patient and sure. I wasn't afraid of being alone. I wasn't afraid of starting over. And I wasn't afraid of who I had become in the process. If anything, I was grateful for clarity, for truth, for the strength age gives you when youth has stopped pretending to help. I finished my tea, stood slowly, and brushed the sand from my hands. The horizon glowed faintly, dim but promising. Before I headed back up the path, I said one last thing into the open air, more to myself than to anyone listening. You're allowed to choose yourself, no matter how late. And if you're reading this now, listening to an old woman's quiet truth, remember this. Don't wait for someone to push you into deep water before you reclaim your life. Choose yourself while you're still standing. The ending was not a splash, but a long, slow walk toward the sun. I reached my front door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. The lock was new, the key was mine, and the night was finally silent in all the ways it should be. The light in the hallway flickered once and then held steady. I sat by the window, watching the stars begin to poke through the indigo sky. Arthur would have loved this view. He would have loved that I finally found my voice. I closed my eyes and whispered a thank you to the wind. The inheritance of shadows had been traded for a legacy of light, and for the first time in my 78 years, I was truly, completely home. My journey was long, my path was cold, but the destination was worth every drop of lake water I had to swallow to get here. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more thrilling stories and emotional dramas. Stay tuned for the next journey.